This interview contains discussion of real-life experiences. To protect the privacy of those involved, all names, workplaces, and identifying details have been changed or removed. Some parts of the conversation have also been edited or omitted due to their graphic nature, in order to avoid causing distress.
This is a two-part series. In episode 1, Ben shares his unique journey from playing in a punk band and touring to joining the police force. He discusses his rich life experience prior to becoming a cop and discusses the challenges and triumphs he faced within the police force, including a life-changing incident where he was shot in the line of duty. His narrative dives into philosophical approach to life, work, meditation practices, and how breathwork and creative outlets played a pivotal role in his personal and professional resilience. Hey Ben, how are you?
Good.
Better reception out there this morning?
I've just come up to my sister's. She's got Starlink.
There you are. Now you're gone. Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Is this December?
No, I just shaved my beard for summer because it's getting really hot.
But you left the mo. Looks cool.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm glad we get to have this conversation because it's a do-over.
Yeah, so we just got power back about an hour ago.
Yeah, nice.
So I'll charge my laptop and my phone.
Yeah, I love these little glitches we keep having. So much fun. Especially when we're trying to do this.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, so we'll rehash some of what we talked about yesterday, but that's cool because I've got a lot more questions that I want to ask you. So you joined the police force in 2015 at the age of 29.
Yeah. So applied, I think, 2013 and accepted or started at the academy in 2015.
Yeah.
So we were squad 1 of 2015, 2016.
Yeah. So before you joined, as I said yesterday, I feel like you, in everything you'd been through, like jobs you'd done, your life you'd lived, I feel like you were already equipped with an arsenal of tools to use to help you through the police force. Because I feel like you'd already been through some ups and downs, but the foundation you established early on, I think is what probably helped you through this process. But if you can guide me through the jobs you did previously, that would be cool if we can rehash that again, because there are some questions that I want to ask you about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I worked just as a builder's labourer, sign installer for a concreting company and a couple other things in there. I worked in a bull bar factory as a powder coater, forklift driver, and in the Army Reserve, and then as a personal trainer. I think in 2011, I got qualified as a personal trainer. And so I'd had some fairly broad life experience and exposure to different kind of communities and different aspects of society. I was also playing in punk bands, hardcore bands, and traveled playing festivals and shows through England, Europe, America, and then around or extensively up and down the east coast of Australia. So
can you tell me a bit more about this punk band life? Because this is what I'm actually interested in. Is it any bands that we would know?
They're more of, I guess, niche or fairly popular within the subculture, not so popular within mainstream radio music. I mean, I started playing in bands. Got my first drum kit when I was 9, I think, and my brother played guitar and he was in bands, and Dad had set up the lounge room with just the instruments and the lounge was off to the sides. A lot of the kids from the neighborhood would come around and we'd jam, and that would be most of our entertainment for the weekends and the evenings. So it was fairly central to like growing up. And I started playing in a metal band on drums when I was 12 and then into high school bands. And then I left, moved to Melbourne when I was 18 to study audio engineering and met a bloke through that course who was starting a band that kind of started. So I think from 19, it all started to fracture and fall apart before I joined the police. But I did do a couple of bands whilst working as a cop, but it mostly settled down. So it was really between 19 to 30 or so. I did most of the music. So writing songs, recording albums, releasing it through overseas labels. So it was fairly extensive and fairly central to my life until it again started to fall apart. And then I started to look for some other outlets or other interests. So
You mentioned yesterday meditation. When did meditation come into your life in all of this? Were you always into it, or did you pick it up again, or?
always been, even since really young, has been interested in the esoteric texts or depth psychology or Eastern philosophy, all these kind of things are just self-interested and self-researched, not studied formally or anything like that. It was more just a personal interest. And so I had conceptual idea of all of these Eastern philosophies and like even secular Buddhism and all these kind of things. But had gone to a bunch of retreats, probably in my early to mid 20s, like meditation retreats, and then just my own practice with that, different forms of meditation or mindfulness or just approaching life a little more aware. And it's not something that I really talked about, and I wouldn't tell people that I meditated. It was really just like a personal practice that I used for myself to keep myself centered and deal with the chaos of and often self-imposed chaos. And
Yeah, tune in with yourself just to relax it all, hey? Quieten it all down.
yeah,
Did you do any singing? Because I know that you said you did writing, but I'm interested to hear this answer.
I did do backing vocals and I did have small parts throughout. It's not really singing as much, it's more like yelling and screaming.
I'm just asking this because given that you've done meditation and you're self-aware, there was something that I listened to quite a few years ago that really interested me, and it's to do with breath work. I don't know, have you done breath work?
Yeah, I trained with Wim Hof 2015.
Yeah.
After I got shot, I tried out for, I could probably get to it at some point, but just referring specifically to breath work, I went back to work and I then tried out for CERT, but I was not in, I guess, the headspace for the kind of discipline and stuff that they were expecting. And then my application was rejected. But at the same time that the CERT course was running, the Wim Hof course was running. And so it felt like a start of a redirection for me where I went to the Wim Hof retreat with that same mindset of doing hard things and like forcing myself through the cold, and because I thought it would make me tougher or more resilient, which it did, but it was the opposite. I had to learn this kind of idea of surrendering, that you're not stronger than the cold. You can't force your way through it. You can't like tense up and grit your teeth through it because it becomes harder. And the more you fight it, the less you can withstand it. So using the breathwork techniques that he used was also pretty significant. I had done things like holotropic breath work and different kind of forms through yoga and things like that. But yeah, I think using the Wim Hof and the cold exposure, not necessarily just for itself, but recalibrating that stress response and being able to tune in and center myself and surrender to the environments when it was more applicable than fighting it or being stronger than it.
Yeah.
So after doing that training, I then started my own cold exposure and breathwork group in Melbourne, and that ran for a good couple of years. And my dog's just growling at the door. Can you hear it?
I cannot hear your dog growling. That's fine. Wants to come in?
Yes.
Yeah. So the reason I'm asking is because with a lot of breath work, it creates like that Kundalini experience, which opens up the pineal gland, which opens up your awareness. And that's what most singers, like when you hear their lyrics and they're very in touch with the other side of the world. And now that I know that and I listen to it, you can tell which ones are really in touch with their breath in terms of, that's what I was asking if when you sang, was that the start of a little bit of an awakening for you, or were you always on that path? But I love the fact that you've gone and done the Wim Hof and then you had your own little group in Melbourne. That's awesome because I love Wim Hof.
Yeah, it wasn't like singing. It was, I guess, being a punk band and like hardcore bands, it's about yelling about the state or yelling about personal betrayal or the problems with the scene or whatever it is. It's more about expressing this kind of anger towards. But I do singing lessons now, and my teacher, she's right off the deep end with all these things. So there's a lot of different practices, and even just like we can hum and stimulate the vagus nerve. We can roll our tongue or our lips or gargle, and all these kind of things are hugely beneficial to switch on the parasympathetic nerves. So yeah, I've always played guitar and written lyrics or I guess poetry and put it to music. And it's usually my go-to, well, it has been for so long. And it pulls me out of the kind of mechanical world into this kind of the creative and expressive and flowing kind of states. So I
Is that
wasn't
your savior?
conscious. Yeah, I wasn't conscious of it. And I didn't know that I was choosing it for that. But looking back and having spent a long time now studying and understanding a lot of these things, it makes sense now that I'd maintain these practices and that they were able to support me through not just like the big events, but the exhaustion of a short changeover or bad night's sleep because you've changed from hours to days or nights to days or whatever. It's just like an active meditation in a way that it's not trying to switch off or internalize. It's still expressive and still creative, but it's not, yeah, it's like an engagement with sound and engagement with practice and all that kind of stuff. So,
Meditation to everybody can come in so many different forms. This could
yeah, and
be
I
one of
find
your forms.
yeah, and even I think a lot of people in the West have a hard time sitting down and in the mind or turning off thoughts, and which kind of becomes the big approach to meditation. And but yeah, something like cold exposure, it forces you to be present. It forces you to pay attention to what's happening, to the rising fears or the shifting sensations and the kind of response to remove yourself from the discomfort, even like using a sauna or anything that I think a difficult relationship or a traumatic experience can become the path towards a deeper understanding. Obviously, helps to have calm and space to remove ourselves to create or clear that ability, but it's no good practicing meditation in the Himalayas on a retreat and then coming back to the real world where you've got deadlines and traffic and terrible relationships or bosses or whatever it is. It doesn't necessarily translate across. So I think we need active practices that we can engage or call upon when needed to then facilitate that into the real world where we are doing things or that we don't get lost in that chaos because it's really easy. A lot of things start happening, body shifts, the chemicals start to release, the breathing changes, all those physiological responses start to happen, and that cascade starts to cycle, and then we get pulled into it, and it's really hard to regain or just to maintain some kind of idea of what that feels like.
Yeah. So I lost myself in the police force. Just hearing you say that, I lost myself. I was spiritual before I went in and I just completely lost
Mm.
everything to do with that. Were you able to maintain some level of meditation awareness tuning in during the police force, or did you get absolved into it too?
It worked really. One of my main focuses going into it, I'd read a book called, I think it's something like Courage Under Fire by John Stockdale, something like that. He was a Air Force pilot in America, I think Vietnam War, but he was a philosophy major at one of these universities and he studied Stoicism. And Stoicism was one of my main interests in philosophy prior to going into the police force. But basically, the nature of the book was that he got shot down and then become a prisoner of war, which is obviously far more extreme than being a cop in a lot of ways. But what he outlines is that he said, "This is now my opportunity to test my philosophy. So to test Stoicism, whether it works or whether it has any value, this is my opportunity." So I took the same idea, again, not as dramatic, but I used my shift as a way to apply this philosophy to, I guess, first of all, test whether the philosophy has any value and whether or not I can adapt to the demands and to the individual circumstances. So rather than, it was really hard. Especially when there's application stress and repetition and fatigue and this kind of overwhelm of, you could be taking a statement from a rape victim and then be straight back on the road to direct traffic. Work really hard, even just around the language that gets used or thrown around. Is people will be, we had to go hands on with this crook. And I was like, what did they do? And it's, it was a mental health transfer. So they weren't a crook, they were in a mental health crisis. And they're like, oh yeah, whatever. And I think that because of the repetition, we can get in this just treating everything as the same. And I think that's where it's easy to lose touch with what's actually happening and how we're responding and how we're feeling, is because our language becomes simplified and our response then becomes really binary. It's like yes or no, or good or bad, or it's wrong or right. And I think, which this approach also got me in a lot of trouble a lot of times, because I did try and work towards like really understanding the situation and trying to develop the best possible outcomes from it. You can become a bit slower in figuring things out if you just use those profiling systems or make those assumptions to speed up your response. It can be more beneficial a lot of times, and you can skip a lot of those steps. But I was fairly adamant. I'm really stubborn as a person, so it just came easy that I would just try and see the individual and try and understand the individual circumstances rather than trying to flatten it to make it easier or more rapid.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my last jobs I went to in uniform, actually, it was literally my last job. I was on overtime. Guy up on the roof screaming, and there were two junior Connies just yelling back at him and just didn't know what to do because he was throwing stuff. And I said, has he got anything more to throw? And they said, no. So I went up there and I just said to him, hey, what's going on? I can see you're having a hard day. What's wrong? You want to talk to me?
Yeah.
And then we actually had a conversation, and he reminded me of video hits in the 80s and stuff like that. He was incarcerated and that was his thing that he looked forward to. But yeah, he was in a mental health crisis. And
Yeah.
I think people forget how, especially when you've been indoctrinated and you go to those jobs and it's same, and you lower your language, you lower your level to they're crooks, they're this, they're that they forget that deep down, everybody's human, having a human experience, and every experience is different. And
Yeah.
we sometimes forget how to relate to those individuals at that point in time because we are like robots just going from job to job to job.
Well, I think it makes it easier emotionally to blunt that and flatten the kind of range of responses to like a list of tick boxes, because then we don't have to invest that much. And if we're not investing that much, we can't be hurt or we can't be drawn into it, and then we can't burn out so quick. But I think that separation or that autopilot or this kind of like this robotic, you get a lot of cops will talk to traffic stop the same way that they talk to a victim, the same way they talk to a crook, the same way they talk to the shopkeepers. And it's like this kind of, they pick a persona and then they apply it to every scenario. And I understand it protects us from having to continually engage, which can be overwhelming, or it's a protection from that overwhelm. But I think that separation creates the burnout. I mean, there's still obviously routine and exhaustion and frustrations, but mostly were inside the organization, not outside. I mean, we could go through many stories, but
Yeah. What are some of those challenges you went through when you say internally? Do you want to expand on that a bit more?
like, for example, I was going to Code 9 or Members in Trouble, and I had a full silver license, and we'd come up to asking if there's any closer units. They said no one came up. So I said, we're en route, blah, blah, blah. I was driving 150 kilometers an hour, which was within the speed limit of the restrictions of the silver license or whatever, on a 4-lane freeway at 2 a.m. with no traffic, well lit, blah, blah, all of that.
Tick all the boxes.
yeah, tick all the boxes, and tripped a speed camera doing 136 or something. I was working with a junior member and I'd spoken to him. I said, and it was only because you've eventually become a bit more aware of things. But I had a conversation saying, there's no point putting our lives at risk to help someone else. If at any point you feel unsafe or you think that my driving is not appropriate or I need to pull back, say so, and we'll have a discussion. If you actually feel that you're going to be injured or whatever, then I will slow down. Anyway, because of trip to speed camera, it bumps up to the superintendent or whatever to investigate. So what they did, they pulled my offsider aside after pulling the MDT data and the GPS data and try to get him to make a statement for reckless conduct endangering life. And fortunately, he was a junior member, but he had a fairly strong moral compass and was able to hold his own in that scenario. Because I know a lot of people, when they come into organization and they see the brass and they go weak at the knees and think, I have to just do anything they say. And fortunately, I had that conversation with him though, and I'd made notes end of the shift of that conversation, which he's told me he's not afraid and that he doesn't feel my driving's irresponsible or whatever it was. And he refused to make a statement and then came and told me. And then the inspector calls me down and he says, well, obviously we need to do retraining, but we find that the driver's school training promotes people driving faster and we don't want that. And you've got a responsibility to these junior members to not teach them these wrong things. And he was like, I know your history. I know what's happened through what happened in the division. And it's partly why we're taking it all into consideration and that you've had no other prior disciplinary, whatever. I said, I don't think that my driving was inappropriate. I arrived at the scene without incident. So in retrospect, if that's what we're using to determine the action, no one got harmed, pulled up, was managed to help out. And then he says, how many briefs came as a result of this? And I said, I'm not sure. I wasn't an investigating member. We just went there to help out members in trouble who pressed their duress button, who screamed on the radio, who didn't respond. They attended a brawl of about 20 people, and it was probably a bad situation. And he said, well, we really need to start thinking about what we're doing and why. And so I wasn't responding to the outcome. I wasn't responding to the amount of briefs or what the offense was. I was responding to the members in trouble. If that was were to happen again, I'd do the exact same thing again. And he's, well, that's not acceptable. And so if that was you in trouble, I'm sure you'd hope that there were people like me out there who can drive fast and who can pay attention to the conditions of the road and continually reassess, not be pulled in blindly with upregulation of the nervous system and not paying attention and running red lights or whatever. I hadn't done any of that. I was fully aware and fully in control. Anyway, he wasn't happy with that and he wrote a letter that got put in my file of how I didn't accept my admonishment.
Yeah, your slap on the wrist. So that story just makes me so angry because you are such a switched on dude who obviously joined because you want to make a difference and you want to do good in the world. There are plenty of assholes in the police force. You're not one of them. And yet they chose to do that to you to try and get you sacked, charged, whatever.
I don't think it was personal. I think that is probably more a fault of the promotional system. There's problem raised. So there's a traffic camera office offense. There's a job for the investigating member, and then they have to show an outcome. So it didn't matter about all of those circumstances that I was able to articulate that an offense hadn't occurred and that it was a reasonable and leveled response. The only issue was that a trip to camera isn't my concern really in that scenario. Sure, red light's different because people can be driving through and they can die. But if I trip a camera, it's not going to there's no increased risk to anyone or anything. And so the fact that they would use that as they have to show an outcome and then use that outcome as an example to get a job. Yeah. And there's so many examples of that. And there was a 16-year-old that they wanted to kick out of the resi care unit who was in bed, and because I didn't kick her out at 3 a.m. because we had nowhere to take her to, there was a full investigation for police in action. They'd kicked her out, or they evicted her the day before or whatever, and she came back to get her stuff, but they locked her stuff up. And then I said, we'll just leave her until the morning. We'll hold the job over. The day shift crew can work out and speak to child protection and get her somewhere else to stay, because she's in bed asleep. All her stuff is here. There's no letter of eviction. There's no safe custody warrant. There's no choice for me to remove her other than as a trespass. And I've got to put her out on the street at 2, 3 a.m.
A 16-year-old.
And yeah. And they told me she could have burnt the house down and you would have been responsible. I was like, she could have been attacked by a pack of people in the street because I kicked her out. There was no fire. The place didn't burn down. She was able to stay safely in the house with a friend and sleep, and the matter could be resolved in the morning. But that led to police in action and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I think there's obviously faults to trying to address each situation and apply like a moral framework rather than a kind of procedural framework to not be robotic in those scenarios, because I think it can slow down decision making. You could say, oh, this dude's sketchy or a scumbag or whatever, he's going to try and run, and say, oh no, he seems okay. And then they run and you're like, oh, I probably should have just jumped to conclusions.
Should have. Yeah, I just find it crazy that, I don't find it crazy, but because in the academy, they tell us that you have to be the one making the decisions and you're out in the road and you're doing this and you have to be steadfast in what you say and what you do. And you have on each turn of those, what you've just given examples of then, been well aware. But yet that's the other thing that really irks me with the police force too, is that it is all procedure. It's not, there's no grey. There's no real grey of, oh, okay, yep, that was your judgment call. All right, well, yeah, no one's hurt, nothing's happened. Okay, let's move on. There's none of that. It's, I would say, almost backwards in what is expected of an outcome. And it's not really, I would say, personable or that driven centric for that. It's not about victims. It's not about the people. It's just about these stupid policies and procedures that they have internally. And if you don't meet them, you're in trouble. And I feel like there's a lot more stress from the internal life than what there is the external. Like, we've all been to some horrible jobs externally, but I think the internal pressure is massive.
Yeah. I think that there was Simon Sinek, I think, talks about it years ago. He explained that why military setups are so effective is because there's so much support internally that you can deal with those things outside better. And even dealing within the corporate world of competition, if there's fractures or mistrusts within the organization, then it loses capacity to deal with the threats from takeovers or mergers or whatever it is. So I can think, and maybe it's all political, maybe there's good intentions and it's shifting in a certain direction because of other reasons, which obviously there's historically through the 70s and 80s, there's some terrible things done by police forces, like bashing homeless people on night shifts for no reason, or gay bashing and all these kind of things, which probably even happened up into the 90s. And it's such horrific past that, and corruption, false evidence, all these kind of things which people get away with for so long, and it starts to define the culture and it starts to define the organization itself. And then there has to be an intervention, and then it takes a new path, and then we just start to see a whole new list of problems start to emerge from those solutions. And obviously we tend to overshoot our solutions because I guess it seems more is better. There's obviously all those stories, but I really enjoyed working as a cop. I think the people that you work with, the ability to deal with terrible things with good people is it's a situation that we don't really get exposed to outside of that. And as I said, there's terrible things, you get exposed to some terrible things. I think the lack of support internally, not only lack of support, but like active targeting of people for promotion or so many poorly managed members and situations, and probably deliberately poorly managed so that outcomes would be worse, so that it'd be a better example. And I was working as an active sergeant before I left for about a year, and it was probably the most insight that I had into these kind of leverage systems where members may be going off the rails because personal situation, maybe their relationship's breaking down and they're having a hard time, and that they start acting out or behaving a certain way. And sergeants are well aware, the bosses are well aware. No one's pulled them in and said, do you need some help? We can see all this stuff happening. How can we support you through this? But instead, it's a sit back, they're taking notes, they're allowing this member to go right off the rails until something happens. And then they jump in and they make an example of it, and then someone gets a promotion. And it's, I think, such a hostile environment just because of its interest in that kind of promotional system. And I think that there was only one instance where I saw a sergeant implemented a study group for members who wanted to become detectives. He would do that before or after his shift, spend an hour with different members, and he would run that every week. And then he used that as his example to get a job, detective sergeant or whatever. But that was the only positive example that I ever saw someone take initiative and invest themselves into the members to improve their abilities, to improve their skills and their skill sets and their knowledge and understanding to benefit their careers, which then he was able to use.
Totally agree with you on that. So it is toxic. It is toxic to do it that way. It's such a negative, because I was myself was also a few acting sergeants tried to use me as an example or tried to do something to use me as an example. And even when I was a sergeant, they did the same. I had senior members trying to tear me down and do that, but I wouldn't back down. I was fighting them the whole way. How dare you do that and use me that way? I was always about lifting people up, supporting people that were shitty enough with what we had to deal with out on the road and sometimes internally. We needed to help each other, not strip each other down, which is what you see, unfortunately, more of and is supported rather than the latter.
Yeah. Even as an acting sergeant, I could go through a junior member's active leaps and resolve half of them within 5 minutes. But instead, they would mostly sit there and write an email back, which would take 10, 15 minutes to tell them what they need to do. And then they still don't know what to do. They're still falling behind. They're still out on the road when they've got to be following these things up. And you can pull them up at some point and say, hey, I got all those from you. All I need to do was this. And they're like, oh, sweet, thanks. And you just lighten that workload. It's something really simple that rather than just think, oh, no, they've got to learn. I had to learn that way. It's who cares how you had to learn? Like, situations change. All of this stuff is terrible and takes way too long. None of it talks to each other. They're spending way too long sitting down trying to figure out these mechanical things when they need to be understanding how the job works, how they respond to these things, how to even deal with what they're dealing with. So, yeah, we could probably make the whole thing about.
Totally agree. What year did you end up leaving?
Left involuntarily in 2021.
Okay. All right. And what year, because you did mention before you were shot, and I do remember that job because I was one of the many people that worked on it. What year was that? Was that early on in your career?
Yeah, that was 2015.
Yeah, I thought it was. Yeah. I was having a thought about that the other day, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure I was pregnant at the time. That's why they didn't call me. But yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, just so people get context? Because I think it's pretty massive what you went through. It was hands on deck for you. We worked hours and hours and hours and just praying for your recovery. Yeah, because it's not every day that something like this happens. It's crazy.
I think I was on leave or come back from taking charge or something. Anyway, I think I had been on a couple of weeks off and I'd started on night shift. So this was, I think, July 2015. Anyway, while I'd been away, there'd been a whole bunch of petrol bombs thrown through Primrose and overnight. And so the previous night shift had been responding to these jobs. The families were just normal families, no connections to anything. They couldn't really figure out what it was all about, other than the assumption that who lived on that street at the time was the target. So it must have been about 3 a.m. There was a shooting at the dad place. And so the sergeant said, this might be connected. Maybe just head down the street and hang around and see what happens. And so I was a PSET. I was working with First Connie, and we were just like, okay. Anyway, we drove down, and another unit had met us there, and it's been a fairly uneventful night. And so all the information was from the jobs was that there's a black four-wheel drive seen leaving the scene. We then, sitting waiting outside the house, had a black four-wheel drive come past us, but nothing like really significant, nothing to say, oh yeah, this is the car. It was a black four-wheel drive. Yeah, it's about 3:30 in the morning, but it wasn't driving any different. It didn't change the way it was driving when it saw us. It just kept to the speed limit, headed down towards the road, I think. And so I just said to my offsider, how long would it take from Met to here? And he said about 15 minutes. And I was like, it's been 15 minutes. And he's, oh, we'll go see. Again, nothing to really get too excited about. So anyway, I was driven up to it. It was sitting at a red light. And then it went through the red light. And oh, maybe this is starting to get dodgy. But again, coming close to 4 a.m., people just do that. And so it then started driving faster, and it took a left, and I'd come up to it, and then my offsider calls it a pursuit. And this was about, I think, a couple of weeks before they changed pursuit policy. So we could just call it whenever we felt it was necessary. So put the lights on, it started driving really fast. We'd followed it down a few turns, we'd lost it, come across it again. Anyway, it turned off, and my offsider knew the area better than I did. He said, this is a one-way street. So I left the lights on, driven down, and it had gone into the school car park, and it had turned around facing to drive back out. But then I'd driven up onto the driveway or across like the gate, but then I'd left a gap so that it could drive out, just because that's what they teach you in driver training. You can't box him in or they have to ram you. And again, I was fresh and I was, I guess, fairly naive. I wasn't thinking that this is a car that's just shot up someone's house and has come to shoot someone else. It could have been another stolen car going around. It could have been a million other things, which isn't unusual to come across other stolen cars while you're following a stolen car, and to lose that one and find another stolen car and to be like, what the hell is going on? So it wasn't, again, maybe it was probably naive to looking back, but the car started to drive towards us. And what I thought had happened was it's rammed into the bonnet, and I've hit my head on the side of the car, which is why I felt like this kind of massive amount of pain inside of my head. See a gun or anything, and I wasn't really assuming that it was connected. Anyway, and then I just remember seeing it still probably a meter away from the car, from the bonnet. And so I was like, oh, it's not. And so time slows down and it speeds up, and it's all regular time. I've now then noticed that it's not at the bonnet. And then I've realized that it was a gunshot that had gone off. And then I pulled my head down to the center console, which obviously was a bit late, and also did the same, but he's done the same thing at the same time. What I feel like is this kind of slow reaction. He saw the muzzle flash and then gone down to the center console. And I've got all these thoughts running through, and then gone down thinking I've reacted really slow, but it's almost like at the same time as him. And he said, that was a gunshot, you okay? And I was like, no, I think it got me. And then I looked down and I was just like covered in blood, and I couldn't really hear out of my right ear, and I couldn't see because all my face was covered in blood. And so I was just reaching around to the back seat, because I was in a sedan, to find my jacket to press against it. My offsider jumped out. He's trying to get into the boot to get the first aid kit, but the car's still running, so the boot won't open. And then the radio's coming up saying, we just need to update what's happening. And so I went to grab the radio, but then I couldn't really talk properly. And then I realized that I didn't know what street we were on, or that I couldn't really give a very good update. And so I yelled out my offsider. He come around back, gave the street, gave an update saying my offsider has been shot in the head. And then, so for me, I was just pressing the jacket into the side of my head. And I guess initially my brain went crazy. Like I started picturing myself like I'd missing half of my head, and kind of my brains coming out through the side. I couldn't see it, and I couldn't really gauge the amount of pain that was there, what it felt like. It felt like it was all missing. And so from that point, I just started talking to myself, like, you got to start slowing down your breathing, because the slower you breathe, the slower you're going to pump your blood, the slower you're going to bleed to death. So I just sat there, and while my offsider was trying to get the first aid kit, I was just focused on slowing down my breath. And then I had some fairly significant experiences, like my life flashed before my eyes, and which was really interesting. It was like insignificant moments, not insignificant, but like normal moments that kind of came to me. It wasn't the walking out of Puckapunyal from, or finishing high school, or finishing my sound engineering course, or it wasn't these kind of big events that came to me. It was just like sitting at home with my brothers on the couch watching TV, or being at the river, or things that just seemed so insignificant at the time. Not insignificant, but non-eventful. And it was just like a series of those kind of situations which kind of played out for me. And
Are
I
you
just,
still conscious at this point in time?
yeah. So
I'm just
I
curious if you were having like a bit of an out of body experience, or yeah.
So all of this started to happen where I'm still in my body, and I'm just through like my own kind of imagination, or like through my own thoughts, was just seeing these series of life events. And then I had this feeling, like it just came to me. It's like this was always going to happen. And that kind of calmed everything. And I was like, oh, and then it made sense. All the breath work, all the meditation, all the philosophy, all this kind of practice that I'd been using the police course to, as my own kind of developmental training to test these stoic philosophies, or to test my ability to keep myself in the chaos. This thought just, or this voice came through, said this was always going to happen. And I was like, okay. And so then I felt everything calm down by then. And so this is all happening really fast, because the sergeant got from in the station to in about 2 minutes. I know the van got there in, again, about 2 minutes. And so all this is happening before anyone's there. And then I had an out-of-body experience where I was just looking down at myself, and I just saw myself, like, just because the head bleeds so badly, I was just like covered in blood.
If you found this video helpful or moving, please like, share, and subscribe. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and stay tuned for more real conversations that will be coming very soon.